This class is now recording, and I want to welcome everyone to our trip to Johannesburg. We're very excited today to welcome Rabbi Levi Avtzon as our guest speaker. Rabbi Avtzon is going to be speaking to us all the way from Johannesburg, and we're very, very excited to learn all about the Jewish community there. Rabbi Avtzon, I'm going to put the spotlight on you. And please, whenever you're ready, go ahead. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everybody. First thing is an apology. In case you were expecting to hear a beautiful South African accent, I am an American. I'm being hosted by an Australian who's living in I'm an American that lives in Johannesburg. Although after 10 and a half years living here, I think I've picked up a accent or two, but you could still hear my strong Brooklyn accent. And actually, Rabbi Liberov is my wife's first cousin. So that's my connection. And Rabbi Wolf, his son Itzik, is my brother-in-law. So double connection, close enough. Okay. So the first thing that comes to people's mind when they hear South Africa, especially if they use Google to do their research, is violence. So I have a lot to say on that matter, but let's not start there. Let's actually start with some geography. And the geography is to simply ask, where in the world is South Africa? Now, we're right now, most of our listeners are in the middle of the United States, Chicago right here. Let's zoom out. Pretty much across the Atlantic, you have the European continent. And right under Europe, you have Africa. And when you go all the way to the bottom of Africa, you come to a country called South Africa. That's the name of the country, believe it or not. Very often people, especially in Israel, will be like, so it's the bottom of the African continent. Is it a country? So as you can see, Africa has a lot of countries, over 50 countries, and it's not one homogeneous place. And even South Africa itself, which is quite a large country with close to 60 million people, is far from homogeneous. When it comes to time zone, it's right now 9:36 p.m. where we are. 7 hours ahead of Chicago. We're about an hour behind Israel if you look at the map. So here's Israel, and we are just a little bit more to the west. But we're usually an hour behind Israel. We don't have any daylight savings time, etc. We just keep the same schedule throughout the year. Flying time from New York direct. Currently, there's no direct flights because the South African airline is having issues. But if I flew direct, which I did many times, it's a 14.5-hour flight to Johannesburg, and sometimes on the way back, one way it's 14.5, the other way it's 16 hours. Now, if I wanted to fly to Cape Town, it would be plus minus another 2 hours. So let's actually zoom into South Africa and actually just get a little bit of a clue where things are. First, I must say that South Africa, from a simply just the way the country looks, it's one of the most beautiful countries on earth. There is the most beautiful scenery from mountains to, as you can see, how big the coast is. We have this whole coast is the Indian Ocean, and this whole coast is the Atlantic Ocean. And if you go here at the corner of Cape Town, you actually come to a place where you see the two oceans meet. It's very different. One of the oceans is more blue, one's green, greenish, one is warm. The Indian Ocean is warmer. The Atlantic Ocean is quite chilly. So when most South Africans say they're going to the beach, they usually refer to this part of the beach. But as you can see, it's thousands of kilometers of beach. Magnificent, magnificent. This whole area over here, especially next to George, Plettenberg Bay, is just unbelievable, and of course, Cape Town. For us in Johannesburg, we are far from the beach. The closest beach to us is pretty much Durban, which is a 6-hour drive. We go all the way right here. There's no water around us. It's actually the largest city in the world that is not on a beach, that's not on a major ocean or major river. It's a very random place to build a city. And the basic history of the city is it was only built 130, 140 years ago when they discovered gold, diamonds, and all the things they found in various areas of Johannesburg. And that's actually what attracted people to move here, because it's literally in the middle of the mountains. It's actually quite high off sea level. Some people who fly into Johannesburg, it takes a bit of time to acclimatize to the air. It's not as bad as other places in the world. They're like really high, but it's quite high above sea level. Johannesburg is pretty much all mountains. Another interesting thing about Johannesburg is it's the biggest man-made forest in the world. What I mean is that if you drive the streets of here, you just see trees and trees and trees and trees and trees. In my garden itself, I must have about 15 different kinds of trees, and that is not an exception. That's pretty much the rule at the place. So if you look at it from I guess from a satellite, you'll see just tons and tons of trees, mostly planted by people. Okay, so Johannesburg is the most, I guess, the second to the most famous city in South Africa. Cape Town perhaps is more famous, but Johannesburg is actually not a capital city. There's 3 capital cities. I don't understand the full history of it, but there's Cape Town, there's Bloemfontein, and there's Pretoria. I will say for any South Africans on this Zoom, please forgive me if I don't get every single detail right. I am an amateur South African historian. I would do much better giving a New York history. That's my City Yankasa. That's the place I grew up. But having spent 10 years here, I think I have the basic facts down pat. Okay, so Johannesburg. My wife and I are a rabbi in a place called Linksfield. Linksfield is, for anyone who knows Johannesburg a bit, there's a very large school in Johannesburg. About 80 to 90% of Jewish kids go to Jewish schools here, and it's quite amazing. And the biggest Jewish school over here, which is more of a secular Jewish school, but much more Jewish than a lot of the secular schools, let's say in the United States. Like the average kid will come out of here knowing how to daven, read the Siddur, etc. So this school is called King David. And King David has various branches, and the largest branch is King David Linksfield. So on the campus, we have a shul. This shul was built about 45 years ago. The community was built about 20 years before that. And the school, this is literally on the center of the campus. Now, this school campus is huge. I don't know the exact measurements, but it's about a quarter of a kilometer in both directions. Like to literally just walk from south to north of the campus would take you a good 5-6 minutes. To walk from east to west, even longer. It's a big, big campus. It has 2,000 kids on it every single day. And our shul, we're lucky enough that it's not only a shul for the community that lives here, but it's used by the school on a daily basis. About 4 years ago, we went on a massive building renovation, and we pretty much renovated our entire space. So what you'll see now is this picture is our renovated shul. It has 722 seats, and 350 families are members here. It is in the Ashkenaz tradition. In other words, they daven the Siddur called Nusach Ashkenaz. Although I am a Chabad rabbi, we obviously respect the traditions of the community. We even have a short video that we made. to try to convince you guys to all become members. So I'm just going to play it. It's actually very, very short, and it gives a little bit of a clue of what. Linksfield Shoal is a shoal that has a beautiful past. Great people who built the shoal and kept the shoal going for many years. And its best days are still ahead of it, with a beautiful campus, with a growing community, with vibrancy, with beautiful brachas, services, shiurim in all our centers. We look forward to greet you. We look forward to have you feel the magic of what Linksfield Shoal is becoming. The future is bright. Okay, so now that I'm convinced you guys all want to join my community, just on that little punt, let's move on and actually discuss the South African Jewish community a little bit. So the South African Jewish community is quite unique. It's unique in the fact that it's very homogenous on the most part. It has, on the most part, Lithuanian Jews. When I mean Lithuanian, literally from Lithuania. Statistically, Lithuania was, I believe, the most decimated community percentage-wise during the Holocaust. Over 95% of Lithuanian Jews died, and therefore today there are very few Jews around the world who can trace themselves to Lithuania, and pretty much the only Jews who can, I would say to the exception of very few others, are South African Jews. The typical South African Jew comes from, at least his grandparents come from Lithuania. They came before World War II. Major immigration took place over here in the late 1800s. There was already a shul in Cape Town that was functioning from the 1830s, 1840s. South Africa was later in the 1800s, and a lot of people came over in the late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of them ran away from various pogroms that were taking place in Lithuania. So I'll give you an example, my wife's family, so I married a South African. Her great-grandfather was born in Lithuania, moved to South Africa to be able to build his future. He couldn't find a wife. Eventually, at a quite relatively older age, in his 40s, I believe, he went back to Lithuania, found a wife much younger than him, moved back to South Africa to a place called Potchefstroom, and had a family. He had 3 sons. Some of them are actually spread all over the world, the Kirsch family. Some live in the States now, but etc. And that's the typical South African story. Lithuanian, came there in the early 1900s. And because of that, there's a very strong homogeny. In other words, most people come from a very similar background. Unlike, let's say, a typical Jewish community in New York or Chicago, that will have Jews from all over the world. We do have a few Sephardi Jews over here who moved in the last, I guess, 30, 40 years from Israel. We have like a few Israelis that move here, but a major percentage of South African Jews come from very similar stories. There are Jews also from Germany, some Yekes, but the South African Jewish tradition is very much a Lithuanian tradition, and they're very proud of that tradition. The typical South African Jew knows a lot of Yiddish words. So this, whether they consider themselves religious or not, everyone knows what herring is and kitka. Kitka is their word for challah. I have no idea how that happened, but they call kitka challah. They all know what schmaltz is. They all have a strong Yiddish, but there's my favorite Yiddish word that they love, which I can't stand, but I love it because it's such a culture, is faribel. So faribel, in case you don't know, it's very important that you be initiated, and in case you ever deal with a South African. Faribel in Yiddish means a bit of an upset. I'm an upset. But in South Africa, it's like a full-on, it's a universe. In other words, if I'm faribeled with you, it's like, it's not just like I'm upset at you. We are now in the category of faribel. So if I didn't give you the aliyah you expected and you're faribeled, it's a full-on thing. Faribel is a word that any South African knows. And it's a full-on culture. As one colleague of mine says, in South Africa, we don't only have Facebook where we friend people, we have Book, where we start off with everybody as friends and then we start unfriending them based on, if we like the way they treated us or not. But forgive me for, any South African on this group, because the South Africans are really an incredible bunch of people. By far the most traditional Jewish community in the world. And what I mean traditional, I mean that until very recently, assimilation in this country was beneath 10%. The average South African Jew knows how to open a siddur, knows how to say Kaddish. Whenever they move around the world, this very big South African Jewish communities, unfortunately, due to immigration, in Australia, in Israel, in England, and in the States and other places, wherever South Africans go, they very much build up the communities. A big part of Sydney's Australia and its Judaism can be credited to the South Africans that moved there. They have a very strong affinity to Shul. They have a very strong affinity to Jewish organizations. Just to give you a little sample, this is an organization called the Chevra Kadisha, or the way the South Africans call it, the Chev. The Chevra Kadisha in an average South African, in an average community around the world, buries people. Over here, the Chevra Kadisha does much more than that, with a yearly budget of about $20 to $25 million, and in rands, which is the local currency, that is substantially more, about a 300 million rand yearly budget. The Chev does incredible work. If you see on the advertisements, they'll say they help 1 of 5 Jews in Johannesburg. And what it means help, literally they have hundreds of seniors living in their senior citizen homes. If they can't afford it, they pay for it. They pay for people's rent if they can't afford it, for people's food. And that's just one organization. There's another organization dedicated just to food, Yad Aron. There's an organization dedicated to people with cancer, Dia Link, to support them. There's an organization dedicated to people who have infertility, Malka Elephant. The Hatzalah is very powerful here. There is an organization dedicated to Jewish security around installations, the CSO, which is one of the greatest, it has one of the strongest organizations of Jewish security. Every shul over here on Shabbos will have security standing outside, even though from an anti-Semitism perspective, this country has one of the least anti-Semitism of any major Jewish community in the world. It's a very strong infrastructure. Almost every Jew I know is somewhat involved in a Jewish organization. It's a small community when you think about it. They did the census recently, and we were thinking that the community is as big as 60, 70,000, but the current numbers are just around 50,000 in the country. Just to give you some perspective, in the 1970s, there was close to 120,000 Jews here, 119,000, I believe. But then immigration became a huge, huge issue, as I'll address just now. Just now in South African means very soon. Don't ask me, it took me a while to get that, but now I actually use it. And now the community is down to 50,000 plus minus. The majority, about 70%, is in Johannesburg, about another 20% in Cape Town, and the other 10% spread around various communities around the country, Port Elizabeth, Umhlanga, Durban, etc. South Africans are very proud of their country, and there's a few reasons why they're proud. First of all, because of the transition it's made from an apartheid regime to a place of a democracy, and that only happened 26, 27 years ago. But specifically, what South Africans love is the lifestyle. There is very few countries in the world that have the lifestyle we have. To give you an example about weather, because I know Chicago, I was once there during the winter when my sister married Rabbi Wolf's son, and I could say that the weather wasn't much different than New York. South Africans, specifically in Johannesburg, don't even know what that weather is. A hot day here is 80 degrees. That's a hot, hot day. An average summer day, a pleasant 70. A cold day here by daytime is 45 degrees. I'm talking obviously Fahrenheit. That's a cold day, but that happens very rarely. There's a few days in the winter that you hit 45. The average winter day by daytime, in its 50s. So basically in the morning, you'll wake up, you'll put on what they call a jersey, a sweater to go outside. But by midday, the sun is baking on you. You'll take off your jersey and you'll actually enjoy the weather. The weather over here is magnificent. Also time-wise, night never starts very late and never goes very early. So for example, the earliest Shabbos will come in by us, or nightfall will be at 5:15, 5:30, and the latest that will come in is 7 p.m. So it's like a very, very stable climate, a very stable time zone. Things are very consistent. So for example, in our shul, we daven Friday night every week of the year at the exact same time. That's like a typical South African tradition. 6 p.m., you walk into shul and the shul will start. That's just the way it is. Winter, it's a bit later after Shabbos starts. Summer, it's a bit before Shabbos starts. You come in, we have a nice choir, we have a nice experience. As you saw the picture of the shul, it's a whole to-do. And South Africans take their shul very seriously. On a Friday night, you could get, in some shuls, hundreds of people coming. People that call themselves Orthodox, and that's something interesting that is also unique about South Africa that I want to talk about. In South Africa, reform and conservatives non-existent. There is no such a thing as conservative over here. Reform is very, very small. They have 2 centers in Johannesburg and maybe a center or 2 in Cape Town. Very, very low key. The average Jew that affiliates themselves with a Jewish community calls themselves Orthodox over here. And what it means is that they go to an Orthodox shul, they'll be circumcised by an Orthodox mohel, they'll get married by an Orthodox rabbi, and they'll get buried by the Chevra Kaddish in an Orthodox cemetery. And we're talking 90%, 95% of the Jewish community will stick to the Orthodox tradition in that thing. So whether they keep Shabbos or not, they still will consider themselves Orthodox, which is quite interesting because very often when they emigrate and they go to a place like America, they feel very comfortable. They feel a bit uncomfortable with the Orthodoxy in America, which maybe they feel is more right-wing, because over here, the Orthodoxy is a very accepting Orthodoxy. You walk into a shul, it's a very non-judgmental space. And unfortunately, what happens, a lot of South Africans that move to America, they actually start hanging around conservative, which they find to be more comfortable. But over here, they would never go to conservative or reform. Over here, they're very, very proud Orthodox Jews. And people have a very deep respect for a rabbi over here. In South Africa, you call a rabbi Ruv, a Ruv. And like people, whether they are practicing or not, there's a deep respect of Jewish tradition, of Jewish values. Almost everybody circumcises their kids over here. Almost everybody that passes away gets buried in a Jewish cemetery. Everyone has bar mitzvahs. All the girls have bat mitzvahs. They call it over here barmis and batis. South Africans like have a word for everything, as you can see. It's like it's a whole culture. It's a whole universe. And let's move on now to the topic that often, I heard the rabbi talk before we started about South Africa not being a destination for travel. So it's actually not fully true. I'll tell you why, because as I mentioned earlier, South Africa is actually quite a big tourist attraction, not so much during COVID, but people come all around the world because South Africa has incredible things that no other country has, or very few. For example, taking you back to the map. So in South Africa, we have a place called the Kruger Park. The Kruger Park, the Kruger National Park is over here where I'm pointing for you. This is a park that's bigger than the size of Israel. It's huge, and it's all a nature reserve. It's all a place where you could just go drive the roads, see lions, and what South Africans love to call the big five, the 5 animals. Like if you went to the Kruger National Park, you went to other game reserves. It's called game reserves here in this country. The first thing is, which of the 5 did you see? Did you see leopard? Did you see buffalo? Did you see lion, etc.? And This Kruger National Park is magnificent. You just go on game drives over there for hours in nature. Small little roads, the lines, they're not blocked off from you. Literally, you could drive down the road, an elephant walks right in front of you. The first time you get pretty nervous, but eventually you actually start realizing how to behave. And sometimes you'll have a buildup of 20 cars because the elephant decided to pretty much park on the road. It's amazing. That's one part. Then there's a place, as I said, various beaches. So Durban is a magnificent place. George is a magnificent place. Cape Town, magnificent place. And then throughout here, there's just the Drakensberg Mountains. This country is, when it comes holiday time, vacation time, South Africans take it very seriously and everyone goes. It is such a beautiful country. Now, the elephant in the room is, if you Google it, you'll see that 6 of the 20 most dangerous countries in the world are in South Africa. And one thing I've learned from life is that until you live somewhere and you get context, you could totally get hyped up. When I got married here in South Africa, many of my friends, pretty much all my friends, didn't come because they were terrified to come to South Africa. You talk to some people when they come to Johannesburg, because they're forced to, they literally sit on the bottom of their car. They sit in the back of the car on the floor because they're scared of something. And is there violence? Yes, there's violence. Personally, in this house that I'm talking you to, I was held up. My wife and I were held up 3 years ago, and it was a pretty hectic ordeal that I will not describe. At the same time, it does not happen today as often as it had happened before. And yes, we live in houses behind walls, but actually I see that as a blessing because my kids play in their big yard and I don't have to worry about them running into the street. And we all live very comfortable lives. I walk the streets, not worried. I'll be honest, sometimes when I go to New York, I'm more worried walking the streets than walking the streets over here. You're cautious, but you eventually just embrace it. There are South Africans that are very nervous, but a lot of us just decide to live here because we make the choice that it's a magnificent life. The violence is there, but specifically talking to you as a Chabadnik, there's another reason. There's 2 places in the world that I know of that the Lubavitcher Rebbe pushed, and I mean pushed extremely powerfully for people to not leave. One of them is Israel, and the other one is South Africa. And here I want to play for you just one example of numerous times that the Rebbe told people his opinion about South Africa. Just wait till the end of the video, which is in a few more seconds. The Rebbe calls back. This is Rabbi Koppelbacher, and this is on the day that Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and people were nervous what's going to happen. The Rebbe said thousands, and I mean thousands of times, to everyone that asked, South Africa will be a good place. South Africa will be okay. And eventually, it penetrated. And Rabbi Yossi Goldman wrote an incredible article a few years ago. Rabbi Yossi Goldman is one of the big rabbis over here in South Africa. And he wrote an article which I think, for me, sorry, I'm just trying to go out of this. For me, says more about, like, it just gives a great description of what the Rebbe did to South Africa. He says how the Rebbe saved South African Jewry. He wrote this, and he put it in the local newspapers as well. And he writes that basically in the 1970s and 1980s, most Jews were thinking of leaving. It was the standard conversation, and many Jews left, about 50%. But almost every Jew that stayed here knew that there was a Rebbe in New York that said it will be okay. As someone else said, if the Rebbe had said to go, there would be no South African Jewish community today. And this has been a huge blessing, knowing that the Rebbe promised South Africa will be okay. And it also brought a major influx of, while other rabbis from other communities were leaving, Chabad rabbis came into this country with absolute confidence it will be okay. And that's one of the reasons why About 50% of the rabbinate here in South Africa, although it's not a Hasidic community, is Chabad. Not only in Chabad houses, there's about 20 Chabad houses here in Johannesburg, as you can see over here. Just these are some of them in Johannesburg and Cape Town, but there's much more because some of these include more than one. But even in the Ashkenaz communities, for example, the Shul Amen, there's Chabad rabbis. And the big reason is because of the Chabad confidence that we came in knowing it will be okay. And it's something that we constantly encourage the community. I often tease the South African Jews that South African Jews, forgive the bluntness, are people who live in heaven but think they're in hell. In other words, they often sit there kvetching and they'll sit there saying, wow, life is so good over there, life's so good over there. I'm like, guys, I lived in America, I lived in Israel, I lived in Europe. This is amazing. I personally, one of the great blessings of my life is that I live here with my family. Not only to be able to be on shlichut, to be on, doing the Lubavitcher Rebbe's work over here and serving as a community rabbi, but simply the lifestyle, the weather, the people, the culture. It's like nights over here are so calm and collected, and people spend time with family much more than other places. Life is not as hectic as other areas. Just addressing COVID for a few minutes. So yeah, COVID hit us quite interesting. And I'm sure you all heard about the South African variant. It's on every newspaper. The funny thing is here in South Africa, you don't hear about the South African variant. Almost nobody has it. It's a non-issue, but like in other countries, for a South African to fly out of South Africa to countries, some places they have to go into lockdown for 3-4 weeks just before they get to breathe outside. But practically we were hit a bit hard, but thank God we were quite spared. Unfortunately, as a rabbi, I did do quite a few funerals. But compared to what New York, other places in the States, I have to say that we came out relatively okay. Obviously, the vaccine has not fully entered over here. Recently, it's come a little bit, but we're pretty confident that hopefully we will not have a third wave and that we will be okay. Now, I want to just share an inspiring story. A story that is personal and really talks to me about the specialty of the South African Jewish community. It's a tragic story, a very tragic story, but for me, it epitomizes what this community is all about. About 2 years ago, there was a very high-profile suicide. A South African boy, while doing tour in Israel, did a very hectic suicide. This boy was super successful, first year in medicine. It went against everything. And unfortunately, I had to get involved and I did the eulogy, etc. But that's not my point. My point was that was just one example of how I saw how this community comes together. When somebody suffers a loss in the Johannesburg Jewish community, they are engulfed with so much love. And what I mean love is literally hundreds of cakes, people coming the whole day, embracing with love, sending meals. The South African Jewish community takes care of itself in ways that are literally unbelievable. I was just with another family that suffered a loss a few weeks ago, a very tragic loss. And people, religious, non-religious, take the family, eat the entire Johannesburg grieves by every big tragedy. And unfortunately, we've been through some really strange tragedies in the last few years. But what's amazing to see is each time it happens, everyone grieves. You know the family, you don't know the family, they're in a different area. It's personal. Everyone carries it and takes it personally. And for me, that achdut, that unity, is one of the hallmarks of this community. Another example of that unity, I believe it's the only place in the world where all the rabbis from all groups, Hasidic groups, non-Hasidic groups, sit together at the same table once a month and meet. It's the most united rabbinate in the world. We never fight, definitely not in public, but even in private, we'll have arguments with deep respect. There's one chief rabbi, there's one what they call Bet Din or Beth Din. There's one central Orthodox leadership, and we respect that. And we're very proud of that. And whenever people say, no, maybe there should be a second Beth Din, I always say, this country is blessed that there's one leadership, there's one kashrut, there's one Beth Din, because what it allows for is a very united Jewish front. It's a very united Jewish infrastructure here. And I would argue that it's most probably the least political Jewish infrastructure of any Jewish community in the world because of its insistence of staying united. And for that, I also give a lot of credit to the Rebbe's head shliach, the head emissary here in South Africa, Rabbi Lipsker, who took it as a mission to fight for unity. In other words, to literally insist, no matter what. And he always encourages us, the Chabad rabbis, that we will never, ever be the ones to break the unity. We will always stand behind the leadership and always focus on building a solid core. So that is my basic presentation. I would love to hear questions. There's so much more I could talk about: the South African community in Cape Town, the Jewish Johannesburg history over the last 120 years. But I much more prefer questions. So let's go for that.
Rabbi Avtzon, if you could stop the screen sharing, and then I think I can unmute everybody so that they can, oh, there we go. Okay. So let's see. Allow participants to unmute. Okay, if you're on the computer, you can unmute yourself. If you're on the phone, you can press star and then 6 and unmute yourself that way. I'd like to ask a question to get things started, if I may, and I may. So you are in South Africa, you are all the way, as you mentioned, the geography, you are all the way at the south of Israel. So do I assume correctly then that all of your shuls would have the front facing north?
Correct. All the shuls in South Africa face north.
That's very interesting. Are there any other interesting
well, there's a lot of interesting. First of all, we are in going into winter now.
Yep.
So we're beneath the equator, so it's like a whole upside down world. So we celebrate Pesach at the beginning of the winter, Sukkot at the beginning of the summer, and Tisha B'Av by us is the shortest fast because it's finished at 5:36 p.m. and Asara B'Teves, which in America is finished at 4:30 p.m., we finish at 8 p.m. So it's a bit of a chalent pot, and it took me a while to acclimatize. Also, the school year is very different. So the school year will start in January and finish in early December. And then they'll have, instead of like this 2.5 month break that they'll have in the United States in July and August, so by us, we get a lot more smaller holidays. For example, we just had what South Africans call a long weekend. There's a shtick over here that if you have a holiday, a public holiday, a national holiday on a Tuesday, for example, you cancel Monday out as well. So you pretty much get an extended holiday, but it happens like at this time of the year, every other week. So it's like the week never starts. Like today it's Wednesday, but I feel it's Monday. I'm all confused. And then in July, we get a 2.5 week break, school break, 3 weeks. And then in December, we get a 5.5 week break. So it's kind of spread out. So people will usually go on vacation twice a year. In July, they'll go for a few weeks. And in December, it's called the big holidays when they go away for longer.
Yeah, one of the things being from Australia that people can't get over is that Hanukkah, there's no snow. There's no snow. Not only is there no snow, but it's hot. And people go to the park and have a barbecue, and there's Hanukkah in the park. There's a big deal on.
But over here, it's even different because of like in Australia, the holidays are a bit after Johannesburg in South Africa. Over here, Hanukkah is a non-entity. It's like I grew up in America. Hanukkah and Pesach are the two biggest Jewish holidays. And in some ways, Hanukkah is even bigger than Pesach. Every Jew in Manhattan has the menorah in their picture. It's almost like the antidote to Xmas. But in South Africa, Xmas is not that big. whatever. Also, you remember, you don't really drive by big buildings and see the trees in people's houses. So nobody has electric menorahs. Hanukkah is just it's late nights because it's summer, so you only can light the menorah at 8 p.m. There's no snow. The whole Hanukkah culture that America has in Europe is non-existent over here. So like, it took me a while to accept that like over here, Pesach's a big deal, Sukkot is a big deal, but Hanukkah is a non-happener.
Very interesting. Okay, let's have questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please go right ahead.
I have a question. You can hear me.
Sure.
I spent a couple of months in South Africa in 1989, which was a very tense period because it was around the fall of apartheid. I was in Cape Town. And I remember that I was also in Oval at the time. And so I was davening in all of the different shuls. And it really impressed me that on Shabbat, there was always a choir, and which was amazing. And I think they duchened on Shabbat, if I remember correctly. I might have it wrong, but I'm not sure. But I noticed there. I don't remember there being Chabad in Cape Town at that time. So I'm wondering when.
So Chabad did arrive in Cape Town in the 1970s, but chances are, I'd imagine you went to, did you go to one of the big shuls? So you either went to Garden Shul or Marais Road Shul. At the time, those shuls did not have Chabad rabbis, but today, Cape Town, most of the rabbinate is Chabad. But there was already a Chabad house, but Chabad was relatively much smaller at that stage when you went. But today, Chabad in Cape Town is very, very big.
Thank you.
Yeah, like the choirs there, they don't duchen every Shabbos, but they take their choirs seriously. But today it's slowly fading. And even the choirs that we do have, my shul has a choir. It's not the choir of like a bunch of baritones, you know, like, oh. It's more Karl Bachi singing, like it's more vibey because I think people have moved on and in the culture, but people still want something. Like when they come into a big shul, like, you know, our shul's big, and we're not one of the biggest shuls. There's shuls that are 2-3 times the size of ours. Like in Cape Town, the Marais Road shul has 2,000 seats. Or here in Johannesburg, the biggest shul is Oxford with 1,600 seats. So like when you walk into such a space and you just have one chazan singing, it's actually, it doesn't really take over the room. Or as South Africans say, it's shemzich. It's embarrassing. That's another one of the South Africans, shemzich. So yeah.
It's interesting.
Julian, you've had your hand up for a long time. Please go ahead.
Rabbi, I live in Chicago. I've been in America 9 years. I lived in Brakpan, Benoni, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. I remember Rabbi Lipska, they had in Hanukkah, they had a mobile, on the Sea Point beachfront, they had a mobile van and they had candles and they were quite busy.
Yes, so, true. So in Johannesburg, there's almost nobody in Johannesburg usually at Hanukkah, but where people go to the beach towns, they'll go to Umhlanga or they'll go to Plet or Cape Town. You do try to bring a bit of Hanukkah there. So yes, they go there.
And also, Rabbi, you didn't deal with any political situation because you're talking about Johannesburg, but when I left, there was quite a lot of Muslim anti-Jewish activity, and South Africa have no connection with Israel at the moment. Unfortunately, they recognize the PLO. Has that changed?
Okay, so let me give you a bit of context on that. So the South African government has a bit of a gripe with Israel that goes back a while because during apartheid, the Israeli government supplied various military items to the government. So when the new democratic government, the black government, came into power, all those who really had a strong relationship with the apartheid government, they have a bit of an acrimonious relationship. And then specifically because For some reason, they decided that the Palestinian cause is very similar to theirs, and they kind of bought into that narrative. So the South African government is more on the left of politics. However, they have a deep respect to the Jewish community, and the Jewish community over here has quite a voice. The chief rabbi is very close to the president, and things have calmed down. In other words, once in a while, there is like a blow up. On the most part, they realize that there's a lot of backlash. A lot of the support that they get is from the Jewish community. So they try to be a little more political about it. But yes, it's not the most Israel-friendly government. However, the society is very Israel-friendly. When we had a demonstration in 2014 pro-Israel, there were a lot of Blacks who came from various townships to come support Israel. It's a very strong Jewish Christian community of pro-Israel. And in general, South Africans are very sweet. And I remember when you mentioned there was a stage where people started getting worried that the Muslims might act out. Thank God they never did. And someone came to a rabbi over here and said, I'm so worried about the Muslims. He says, the Muslims in South Africa are like the Jews. They're parv. Like, in other words, they're chilled. No, like this, the typical South African is very parv. They're very chilled. And thank God, the anti-Semitism over here is pretty much a non-issue, especially when you see what's going on in the States, when you see what's going on in Europe, right. Even in Australia. I feel very blessed to be in this country because, like, you know, yes, there's violence, but as I tell people, that they want my money, they don't want my life. So yes, there have been a few crazy stories where like they take the life just because they don't respect life, but there's not this hatred. So even when I had my holdup, which was quite a hectic situation, deep down I knew that unless I do something stupid, I'll come out of it alive, because it was never about me. They just wanted my items and whatever. So yeah, again, the violence is an issue, but I just listened to a presentation from CAP, which is an organization that fights violence here. It's quite a strong organization. They have vans that drive around all the areas. And they showed the statistics how they've taken down violence from the early 2000s by over 90%. There was a stage in the early 2000s that things were absolutely crazy. But for example, now the area I live, even my house, in the last 2 years after the break-in, the whole area is closed off. To drive into the area, you need to go through a guard's booth. And pretty much I sleep at night feeling very comfortable. The whole area, which is about 150, 200 homes in Linksfield, is yeah, it's protected. There's these cars driving the whole night. And I sometimes wonder why other Jewish communities that, like in Brooklyn, et cetera, that suffer such violence don't copy the South African model. Because there's no question that we've managed to alleviate a big, big part of these issues. And once you take crime out of the picture, the other area that worries South Africans is the government. There was a lot of corruption in the previous government under Zuma. Thank God now the government is not as corrupt. But as I often remind people, I said, look around the world. It's not exactly paradise when it comes to corruption outside the world. Outside South Africa, but things like right now they're fighting corruption very hard. There's a big commission to go into all the various corruption that happened in the decade of Zuma. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
Okay. The issue is another issue that we have over here is cost of living, because there's no government subsidies. There's no such thing as Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, WIC. That doesn't exist. Pretty much I pay everything out of my pocket. Medical aid, okay, it's not American rate, $1,000 a year on medical aid, but I'm paying about $1,000 a month in South African currency. It's quite a substantial amount of money. To have very good medical aid. The medical community over here is top-notch. People will come from all over the world to use South African surgeons. The hospitals over here are very, very high caliber. The first heart transplant, I believe, was done over here, and other major surgeries historically. So, but yes, the cost of living is a bit tight, but I don't think America's cost of living these days is either pleasure, but we didn't get any $5,000 checks from the government. So, yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if I'm asking this properly, but since you said they're very traditional.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, I said I'm not sure if I'm asking this question properly, but you said since they are all so traditional, are they still interested in having more personal growth, and what do you do with them to do more personal growth? And my second question, not related at all, is how come you don't have the vaccine there?
So first of all, the vaccine has arrived. I'll start with your second question first, but it hasn't arrived as quickly as others. So for example, the whole medical fraternity has had the vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson, but hopefully within the next 6 months, they intend to vaccinate a big part of this country, and hopefully they'll be able to do it. In regards to the Judaism of the community, I have to say, I didn't mention it, that the highest ratio of Baal Teshuvas in the world of any Jewish community is in South Africa. The entire Frum community, which is about 20% of the South African Jewish community right now, is all Baal Teshuvas, all people who became Frum later on in life. So the tradition has hugely helped. Not only has it held against assimilation and kept people Jewish, in the 90s and the 80s and the early 2000s, it brought back thousands and thousands of Jews. And right now, there's the Frum community over here, which maybe 30, 40 years ago was minuscule, is a major, major player in the Jewish community over here. So actually, per ratio, it's the highest Baal Teshuva community in the world, specifically Johannesburg.
Could you tell us about your chinuch there, the yeshivas, the Beis Yaakovs?
So yes, so as I mentioned, on the secular spectrum, there's like whatever the King David, where most Jewish people go, but there are a lot of Haredi schools. There's a Chabad school called Torah Academy. The Litvische have 4 schools, don't ask me why. They have like each one's its own level. They have Shari Torah, Hirsch Lions, Maharsha, and the most hardcore is the Cheder. The Mizrahi have a school, it's called Yeshiva College. So that's quite a bit of schools. And then the girls have a Beis Yaakov. So yeah, there's a lot of options of chinuch education over here from all varieties. There's a Yeshiva Gdola here, both a Chabad Yeshiva Gdola and a Litvische Yeshiva Gdola. There's a lot of kollels where people sit and learn after their marriage. There's a lot of learning that takes place over here. It's a very, very involved Jewish community. There are about a dozen kosher restaurants with real quality stuff. Lots of kosher stores, kosher butcheries, Chalav Yisrael, like pretty much you could get everything you want over here. There's a few Judaica stores, Sofrim, the whole Jewish, yeah, everything. Everything you would need, you could get over here. Yes, Julian. Sorry, let me unmute.
Can you explain the seating arrangement in your shul? It looks like bleachers, and it's not like facing the Aron Kodesh or the bima. It's left and right.
It faces the choir. It faces the choir. The bleachers are for the ladies. The men are downstairs. The mechitza is not the greatest mechitza on the planet, but the Beth Din is okay with it. So yes, when everyone stands up for Amidah, for Shemona Esrei, they do face north. They just, the seat goes automatically when they sit down, when they stand up, and then they face north. But while they're sitting, they're facing east and west.
I remember when I lived in Johannesburg, Cape Town and Johannesburg, the women used to kvetz. They used to kvetz about the cost of chicken. They used to say the chickens are cost.
They still do. They still do. It's a standard thing for South Africa. It comes Pesach, everybody got a kvetch about how much matzah cost this year. Did you see the matzah 50 rand? Last year was 48 rand. And the kosher chickens, it's like the ultimate conspiracy. The kosher chicken, compared to non-kosher, it is a bit expensive. If you buy frozen, it's not that bad. But yeah, one of the big politics in this country is kosher chickens. Why is kosher chicken so expensive? No matter how many times it tries to get explained, it falls on deaf ears. It's kosher chickens.
Right.
God knows, yeah.
How long
How
is the
much
flight from Chicago to South Africa? How long is the flight?
17 hours, 16, 17 hours. But there is no direct flight. So you would fly either through Atlanta, Delta has a flight, or you would fly through Europe or New York. Or, recently, I flew through Qatar. That was one of the only airlines I was able to fly to go to New York for my father's yard site. I had to fly Qatar, which was a 26-hour experience both ways. So that was not great by any stretch. Deborah, yes?
I have quite a few friends from South Africa, and I feel that everything that you've spoken about in terms of the community is reflected in these friends that I have, and I feel very fortunate to have them. I feel I'm a child of survivors, and somehow I feel that there's a connection there. So, but they're all lovely people, and I feel blessed to have them and feel everything you talked about reflected in who they are, how they conduct themselves in the community with halacha. So they're lovely.
Yeah, I know quite a few South Africans in Chicago. Chicago doesn't have the biggest South African Jewish community, but has quite a substantial amount of South Africans. South Africans are everywhere. That's the fact. It's like South African Jews are everywhere. And interesting, South African Jews who emigrate, there's two styles. There's the South African Jew who has to justify to themselves why they left South Africa, so they can't stop cursing out South Africa all day, every day, trying to convince themselves, because ultimately very few South Africans leave South Africa and go to a quality of life which is nearly the same quality that they had. So that's one South African. And there's the other South African who will talk very, admiringly about South Africa. They'll say it didn't work out for me, but they still miss it and they crave it. So whenever I meet South Africans in what we call the diaspora outside of South Africa, it's either the one that's trying to convince me South Africa is the worst place on the planet, and I often feel like they're trying to convince themselves, or they're actually just talking about how much they miss this place. Because with all the issues it has, there's very few places on earth that could compete with the community, with the lifestyle, with the kinds of, and I think any South African who's on this would agree with me that there's just certain things that can never be recreated anywhere else.
I've got a comment, if I can. When I was in South Africa, I remember visiting a kosher winery, and the wine the bottle had a big Mogen David on it, and it was obviously, very Jewish wine. And the wine master said that the Chabad would not give its sanction, the Muvushal sanction, because the heating was not
a very random thing to remember from 35 years ago. Yeah, it's true. Basically, there's this argument between the various poskim in halachic authorities how much the machinery has to be heated between kosher wine and non-kosher wine. And for whatever reason, the Chabad rabbis felt that the way that they go through the koshering process of the wineries here, it's not up to scratch. So a lot of the South African local wines, the Chabad doesn't drink. But yeah, that is a very random thing to remember.
Yeah, true.
Okay, guys, I'll take one more question and then I'm going to hit the sack. Yes, Julian, our local South African. You could unmute yourself.
Julian, you're on mute.
Sorry for talking so much, but as a matter of interest, the climate in Australia is very similar to South Africa. They're on the same latitude, right?
Well, I can tell you that in terms of the cold, yeah, it doesn't get very cold in Australia either, and we certainly never see snow. But it does get hotter than 80 degrees. In terms of Celsius, we can have temperatures in the summer going up into the low, or even at the very extreme into the mid 40s. So that would be
Now-
well over 100.
A hot day by us, if Celsius is 32.
Yeah, no. In the summer, I mean, every year you get days in Australia going into the high 30s, and low 40s would be remarkable, but it certainly happens. And at the very highest extreme, 44, 45, that would be really scorching. So anyway, Rabbi Hutz, I want to thank you so much for your class today. It was really terrific, very enlightening and informative and enjoyable. And thank you so much again, and want to wish you a lot of success in all of your activities, and spreading Yiddishkeit even more than is currently, and always going from strength to strength in your holy work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, stay well, everyone,
you.
and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you.
Bye bye. Seid gesund.
Bye.